Hello everybody, my name is Zen, and in my 12 years of uploading daily YouTube videos, this is the first time that I've ever had to release a video like this. You see, I've got a video series called First Impressions. It's a series that it is what it says on the tin. I jump into a game from the beginning and give my first impressions of said game over about 30 minutes to an hour. Games that require more playtime to give an accurate impression fall under my Impressions series, where I provide an in-depth analysis of a game after putting significantly more time into it. You see, over a year ago, on December 5th, 2022, I released a First Impressions for Total War Warhammer 3. And at the time, I found it had some really cool offerings, but I gave it a pretty scathing review after about 30 minutes of gameplay. I found that it was slow, boring, and just generally not interesting. For the first time in 12 years of daily video uploads, I've finally had to upload an apology video because I was wrong. I'm sorry for not giving the game more time, and I've recently done just that. It's actually an amazing series of games, and I'll be discussing what I like about it later in this video. However, I must first invite you on a journey with me. It's the journey that I've been on since fall of 2022, where my love for Warhammer began, and how I've arrived here at this very specific video. If you know absolutely nothing about Warhammer or have no interest in it, then this is the video for you. By going on this journey with me, I hope to evangelize Warhammer as a concept to you and why you should care about it, even as just a passing interest, especially with upcoming TV and movies with Henry Cavill as the creative director behind all of that. So let's start at the beginning. What is Warhammer? Well, that's a loaded question, but simply put, Warhammer is an intellectual property, also known as an IP, and it falls into two main umbrellas. You have Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer Sci-Fi, also known as Warhammer 40k, which is the year that particular piece of IP is set in. Hopefully you've heard about some of this to some description. The Warhammer IP itself is owned by Games Workshop. It's a UK-based company in Nottingham, and they often license their IP out to other companies to make stuff like Total War Warhammer, which is why you've likely heard about it in one way or another. But the heart of their business is making miniatures. But Warhammer, at its core, is a war game played on a tabletop with miniatures. In Warhammer, two players go head-to-head with an army of their choice. They duke it out to control objectives and score points. The player with the most victory points at the end of the game wins. Pretty simple. If you've ever played a strategy game, whether it be something real-time like StarCraft or even turn-based like Civilization, you'll grasp the concepts of a war game pretty easily. But in 2022, I got into my first war game. It was Star Wars Legion. And like Warhammer, you control an army of your choice. But in this case, it's like the Empire, Rebels, Separatists, the Republic, the Shadow Collective, You build an army of these miniatures and you fight against your opponent in big epic battles. And I was drawn to Legion because I really wanted to get into a war game of some type, but I was already heavily invested in Star Wars. And this is going to seem like a sidetrack at first, but it's not. In January of 2022, I launched my own company where I 3D print and sell miniatures. My primary audience was the D&D crowd looking to buy miniatures for fantasy games, but I noticed a surge in buyers who were looking for miniatures that would represent units in their armies for Warhammer. And as a reasonably good painter, I had also begun painting miniatures for customers who requested it as a commission. And business was good. It was really good. And here's the thing. I understood the D&D crowd really well, but it bothered me that I was kind of oblivious to what wargamers wanted. So I decided to dive in and find out, which is why I picked up the Separatist/Republic starter set for Star Wars Legion. And my stepson and I assembled all the miniatures when it arrived, and we got to playing on the island of our kitchen, which at the time happened to be big enough to play a full game of Legion on. And we had an absolute blast. I was totally hooked. I continued to buy new units to fill out my armies and was quickly getting up to speed on the needs of your average wargamer. However, by playing Legion specifically, I was missing out on potentially the biggest market for my business, which is the Warhammer players. You see, Warhammer 40k is the biggest war game, period. And Warhammer Age of Sigmar is the second biggest. So Warhammer absolutely dominates as far as this particular market is concerned. Towards the end of 2022, I started doing research into Warhammer. But honestly, I had no idea where to start. I was pretty intimidated by the whole thing, and that's where my Total War Warhammer 3 video comes into play. I decided to get my feet wet at that point with Warhammer, but what I didn't know is that I wasn't quite ready for Total War just yet. And to be perfectly honest, that experience soured me a little on Warhammer, and I put it off. Like, all of my ongoing research was just put off for several months. And in early spring of 2023, I opened my paint commissions to gamers at my local game store and received so many requests that I was booked for several months ahead of time. I'm still booked for several months ahead of time. And needless to say, it was very overwhelming. And if you've watched any of my videos in the last year, you'll have heard me discuss how I have just a lack of personal time because I'm working nonstop to keep up with the demand of my business and the commission painting. But one of the first commissions that I got was to paint a character called Magnus the Red, and the guy wanted it painted like the box art. And Magnus the Red is from Warhammer 40k, despite looking very fantasy-like, and he was a Primarch, which is like a big boss man of the Thousand Suns Space Marine chapter before they fell to chaos and betrayed the Emperor of Mankind. It's all very dramatic. The demonic powers of chaos twisted him into this monstrous figure that he is. And as a miniature, he is freaking huge. He is like 8 or 9 times bigger than any other model on the table, maybe bigger than that. And he commands very powerful psychic abilities that are like magic. And honestly, I needed to learn all of that before I even started painting him. And I think I did a pretty good job mimicking the box art with this particular commission. You can judge by the pictures, but I had a lot of fun painting him, and this was my first foray into painting Warhammer. But all of that is to say that from this moment forward, I was back in. I began watching videos of people playing Warhammer 40k, such as 40k in 40 minutes from Play on Tabletop, recommend them, and lore videos from Arbiter Ian, which I find to be one of the best lore channels out there because he does it in a way that isn't boring. And I was desperately, trying to pick an army of what I wanted to play for myself. I had Star Wars Legion, but I didn't have 40k stuff, so I was like, what was I going to pick? There were so many to choose from, I had no idea. Should I play as like the venerable space wolves, or the Necrons looked really rad. The Adeptus Mechanicus minis are incredible looking, but they have maybe a little too many details on them to paint a whole army of them in my spare time. And you can't forget about the Tyranids, which are basically the Zerg, because that's what the Zerg was inspired by, and the Tau. Who doesn't like giant mechs and spacesuits and stuff like that? And honestly, I had analysis paralysis. But all of this came at the perfect time for 2 reasons. Number one, the 10th edition of Warhammer 40k was getting ready to launch, and it would be the perfect point for me to jump in new. Regardless of what army I wanted to play, I committed to pre-ordering the Leviathan box, which is like a starter box, from my local store. And at that point, I would have some Space Marines and some Tyranids to play with, because that's what came in the box. It also came with the rule book and a bunch of other stuff. And it was just a cool box to start with. And because everybody was starting 10th edition for the first time, even though there are many carry-on rules and people who had played previous editions would understand it better than I, they were still learning at the same time. So it was the perfect starting point. But the second reason is that Diablo 4 had just launched. Now, that may seem completely unrelated, and I get it, but it had planted a very important seed in my head that would eventually grow into my love for the Sisters of Battle. Why? Well, I loved the fanatical belief that the Church of Light fought with against the demons of hell in Diablo 4. It was awesome. And one day I was scrolling through the official Warhammer community site and I saw this piece of art. It was at that point that I knew I had to play the Sisters of Battle, specifically the Order of the Bloody Rose. So I bought the Combat Patrol, I started assembling models, and I started painting. And you know, it was around this time that my stepson started showing interest in playing 40K with me. So I made a deal with him. He and I would read through a Warhammer 40K book together, and whoever finished first would get to pick a Combat Patrol of their choice for me to buy. I had no intention of winning. It's obvious when you hear me say it, right? But to him, you know, he didn't quite grasp that, so it was a competition to him. But, you know, all credit to him, he did in fact actually beat me by about 20 minutes. I was racing to the end, and I was like, even if I win, I'm not gonna quote unquote win, but he actually did beat me. We read through Horus Rising, which is the first book in a very long series of books covering a thing called the Horus Heresy, which takes place in Warhammer 30K, right? So 40K is the year 40,000. 30K, yeah, you get that. And it's basically sets the stage for what happens in Warhammer 40K. It's awesome. It's really, really good. And he chose the orcs, by the way, when he won. And since then, I've read other Warhammer books, such as Celestine and the second, third, and fourth books in the Horus Heresy series. Will I finish the whole series? Probably not, but I've greatly enjoyed my time with those books so far. They're freaking fantastic. They're well written, and I love them. And I was completely in the thick of Warhammer at this point. I enjoyed learning about it, I enjoyed listening to the stories, and I enjoyed playing the games. Now stick with me, because this is where we get to my recent time with Total Warhammer 3. So during Black Friday last year, I went down to my local store to see what models I could get on discount for my Sisters of Battle, because let's be real, Warhammer models are stupidly expensive for what you actually get, and buying things at a discount is much preferred compared to the ludicrous MSRP that you get for normal Warhammer stuff. More on that in a bit, though. And it was there that I found the Age of Sigmar Dominion box for $40, which has an MSRP of $200. This is the equivalent of that Leviathan box that I bought for $40K, but it's for Age of Sigmar. I literally could not bring myself to pass up that deal. Even if I wasn't currently playing Age of Sigmar and I was fully invested into 40K, that box, I just had to pick it up. And honestly, it still sits under my painting desk completely unassembled in its box, but it did plant the seed of learning and playing Age of Sigmar sometime in 2024. So we've not really talked about it yet, but Age of Sigmar is the current flagship game for Warhammer Fantasy. Instead of Space Marines, evil aliens, warped demons, you've got, you know, fantasy stuff like elves, dwarves, orcs, etc. But unlike 40K, Age of Sigmar is relatively new. Its predecessor was a game called Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and those of you who have possibly walked by a Games Workshop store sometime between the 90s and 2010 may have seen this game. But here's a brief history for you. So Games Workshop was founded in 1975, but didn't publish its first Warhammer game until 1983. It's been around a while. This was Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which we will refer to as Warhammer Fantasy from this point forward. And it wasn't until 4 years later in 1987 that 40K was released. Now, Warhammer Fantasy is considered a rank and flank war game, where your units form ranks and march forward on the battlefield like ancient armies would. And the way your units are facing matters, as getting flanked by opponents will impose penalties on them, and your archers should like always remain behind the front line units, but need to be protected from like fast moving cavalry that can go and flank you, and positioning and movement is really key to success in these rank and flank type games. Warhammer Fantasy continued to be published for decades, and the final edition, which was 8th edition, was launched in 2010. The final book of that edition also had released in 2015, but Games Workshop was planning for a new game system to take its place, and that was Age of Sigmar. Age of Sigmar is a lot like 40k in many ways, and it breaks from the traditional rank and flank gameplay that Warhammer Fantasy was known for. Age of Sigmar was also going to be a modern system with modern-looking hard plastic models, and Warhammer Fantasy has the unfortunate issue of having fairly dated miniatures because they came out, 20, 30 years ago. But Age of Sigmar was going to be the absolute new hotness. Now, Age of Sigmar had its issues when it launched in 2015, but it did find a very large audience of people who loved the game. Sure, it's not selling the same numbers as 40k, but it is still the second most popular miniature war game out there. However, there is still the vocal group of people who really miss Warhammer Fantasy. And sure, they can still play 8th edition, and many still do, but that game wasn't supported anymore by any new models or releases, and that just kind of kills the community for it. But that is until now. Yeah, that's right, Games Workshop has now decided to bring Warhammer Fantasy back, even with Age of Sigmar still existing. However, they wanted to modernize the rules and provide a handful of new models for the fans of the original game, and players could still use their old armies in this new game, but the new rulebook would kind of breathe fresh life into it, and that is what is now called Warhammer The Old World. And here's the thing, The Old World has dozens of things about it that I just don't like. In fact, the rulebook itself is a little bigger than the 40k rulebook, but the 40k rulebook is like 3/4 of it is just like lore and art and like here's really cool pictures of models that you can go buy. The Old World book, which is the same size, it's like a novel, it's huge, is all rules. There's a lot going on there, but there is something that captivated me about it. The initial release of the Old World is clearly there to gauge interest in the product, and it still hooked me like immediately. So for the Old World, they're releasing 2 new box sets to begin with. So one for Bretonnia, which are like knights, and one for the Tomb Kings, which are like mummified skeletons. And yeah, sure, knights and peasants are cool and all, but that Tomb Kings box got me. There's just I don't know what it is. There's just something awesome about ancient skeleton hordes that are Egyptian themed that like speaks to me as a collector, as a painter, as a player. And the box comes with mostly old models made in hard plastic that look incredibly dated compared to recent Games Workshop releases. However, these minis have a certain charm to them, and I can't put a finger on it. Like the skeleton horses look so stupid. They look like skeletal horses from Lego. But I somehow still find them really cool. I don't know what it is. So when Games Workshop put the pre-orders up for the Old World, I was clearly going to jump in and buy a box of Tomb Kings, right? No, as it turns out, because these boxes were incredibly overpriced for what you were going to get, especially since most of the models were copywritten from decades ago. I wasn't going to go out and spend literally $290 for a box of Tomb Kings. Like, it's not feasible. And this put me in a conundrum. I had the itch to pick up and play the Old World, but I didn't want to spend the money on it because it was insanely overpriced. So whatever would I do? Well, I made the financially responsible decision and bought Total War Warhammer 3 instead. So despite my feelings on the game a year ago, I needed something to kind of scratch that Warhammer Fantasy itch without dropping literally hundreds of dollars on a war game that I wasn't even sure I could find other people to play with. Plus, the game was on sale, and I could justify $25 on a game that I might play for a dozen hours and part ways with if I still wasn't feeling it. I also bought the Total War Warhammer 2 Tomb Kings DLC, which is really hard to say, by the way, and it works in Warhammer 3. So it's just, yeah, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I really wanted to play the skeletons, right? So let's address my criticisms of the game the first time around. I found it slow, boring, and I was uninterested in anything going on. Well, those criticisms weren't untrue. In fact, I felt the same way this time around too. Just like the first time, I started the prologue campaign, which is intended for entirely new players to be taught the ropes and introduce you to the fantasy world of Warhammer. And while the prologue does do a good job of teaching you the grand concepts of Total War quite well, it does it in a very dry and slow way. It's like the faction they choose for you to play, they're just humans with a Viking wrapper on them. Initially, I was like, cool, Vikings, but they don't really use any of the strengths of that flavor of that particular faction in a way that would hook me. Therefore, I was bored for the first couple hours of the prologue. But I kept thinking how much I was disinterested in this faction and how I wanted to go play my bony boys, and it just made the situation worse. However, I got the hang of the game quite quickly, and I literally forced myself to finish the prologue over a couple of play sessions. Didn't do it in one setting. Honestly, I'm glad that I did, because I would have missed an otherwise excellent intro into the fantasy world of Warhammer. Now, I'm not going to spoil anything as far as the story is concerned in case you are interested in going through the prologue yourself, but the ending is really fantastic, and it is very Warhammer. It made me turn to my wife and exclaim, "This is an excellent way to be introduced to Warhammer," if you're willing to potentially suffer for a couple hours first. Now, outside of the prologue, the game has a full story-driven campaign called the Realm of Chaos, and a whole separate sandbox campaign called the Immortal Empires, which is kind of more akin to a game of Civilization. And the game has a huge amount of races that you could choose to play as, but many of them are optional DLCs that span the course of the 3 different games. And if you happen to own one of the factions DLCs for Warhammer Total War 1 or 2, then those will work in Total War 3. But you don't need to own those other 2 games in order to still purchase the DLC and play them. It's kind of a weird setup, but it's just the way that it works. And unfortunately, many of the more popular factions are paid DLC, such as the Lizardmen, the Tomb Kings, the Skaven, which are Ratmen, the Elves, and Creative Assembly has received quite a bit of heat for their questionable business choices for these games. But they've also recently made a bunch of promises to release more content-rich patches and DLC, which should add significant value to the game. And the campaign mode is actually fantastic. I recommend playing through it, and even if you were just to pick up the game to play through the campaign, it's really good. But if you're still hooked after that, then they have that more sandboxy gameplay where you can just kind of do your own thing and play with other people. You know, it's multiplayer as well, and it's really good, and I do definitely recommend it. So to summarize, I was wrong about Total War Warhammer 3. Due to my journey with the Warhammer franchise, I decided to give it another shot, and I'm glad that I did. I've since put a lot of my free time into playing the game, and I'm now very much looking forward to the rumored 40k Total War game. And outside of Total War, it appears that Age of Sigmar 4th edition will be coming out this year, and I can't help but share my excitement for a franchise that has been making me more and more excited to delve deeper into its rich worlds. In fact, I just also recently picked up a box of Seraphim for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, which is the lizard people, and they're freaking awesome. I bought their the Christmas box that they came out with in 2023, and it's basically half of an army. So I've got a bunch of lizard people and crazy spellcasting frogs. I'm really excited to put those together and paint them. But what are your thoughts on Warhammer and Total War? I'm curious how many of you got into tabletop games via the video games or vice versa. In fact, I would love to hear all of your Warhammer stories in the comments, so be sure to share them with me and I will read through every single one of them. But if you like this video, be sure to hit the like button down below to help share it to more people. And if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. But with all that being said, thank you very much for watching, and we shall see you all next time.